Good afternoon and welcome to this open forum debate. The topic today is freedom of speech, where to draw the line. What constitutes freedom of speech and where or whether or not at all one should draw a line is a debate that's taken centre stage in most parts of the world. Our guests today are Benedict Rogers, the co-founder and chief executive of Hong Kong Watch and deputy chair of the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission. And he will start with his speech on blasphemy, conscience and protest, where freedom of expression, freedom of religion and politics meet. After him, we'll be hearing from Loveena Tandon, who's a broadcast journalist for over 20 years and foreign correspondent for one of India's top media groups, India Today, and documentary maker. She'll be speaking on policing freedom of expression. And lastly, we're joined by Janis Makarewich-Hall, who is the Deputy Director of Radio, Press and Media Freedom at the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sports. And she'll be talking to us about the UK's National Action Plan for the Safety of Journalists. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And first, I'd like to hand over to Benedict.
Well, thank you very much. It's a really great pleasure and privilege to be here at the Open Forum and particularly to share this panel with the other distinguished speakers and addressing this incredibly important topic. I will bring more of an international focus to the discussion. I know the other two speakers, I think, will speak more about issues relating to our own situation in the United Kingdom. But of course, all the principles of what we're talking about are interrelated. And this question of freedom of expression affects all of us around the world, wherever we are. I want to start by highlighting the intersection of a number of different key human rights, basic rights. And it's interesting, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, these three rights that I'm going to focus on come immediately after each other in the list of articles in the UDHR. The right to freedom of religion or belief, or in its fullest form, freedom of thought, conscience and religion, set out in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration, freedom of expression, set out in Article 19, and freedom of peaceful assembly, protest, in Article 20. And for me, having worked in the field of freedom of religion or belief for many years, working for freedom of religion or belief for people of all religions and none, and also being a former journalist for whom media freedom is incredibly important, and as a human rights activist who speaks very often at protests, particularly in relation to Hong Kong, China, and Myanmar. These three rights are particularly dear to me. So I'm going to focus briefly on three parts of the world where these three rights are under fire: Indonesia, Myanmar, and then Hong Kong. And I want to start with a quick story from Indonesia. Some years ago, in 2012, in fact, almost 10 years ago, there was a young man called Alexander An, who ended up being jailed for 2.5 years in Indonesia because he expressed his views on religion. It turns out his freedom of religion or belief was being undermined, not because he had a religion, but because he did not have a religion, and he chose to express that. He expressed on Facebook that he was an atheist, that he didn't believe in religion, and he ended up being charged under Indonesia's blasphemy laws and was imprisoned. And I went to visit him twice in a remote jail in West Sumatra in Indonesia, because I really believed that it was vital to defend his basic rights. I happen to be a Christian, and he was a little surprised when I arrived and said that I worked for an organization, human rights organization called Christian Solidarity Worldwide. And he said to me, "Don't you know I'm an atheist?" And I said, "Well, of course I do. But I said, you and I have different beliefs, but nobody should be imprisoned for their beliefs. And that's why I'm here, to see if there's something that I can do to help." And I campaigned for him. He was eventually released. And in fact, I met him a number of times after his release. But I think that case is the first illustration I want to give of somebody's basic rights to express what they believe, landing them in jail. The second case, also under the blasphemy laws in Indonesia, is the case of the previous governor of the capital, Jakarta, a man who was known by his nickname of Ahok. And Ahok was a very popular governor. He was respected for having made big improvements to public services. He was widely expected to be re-elected in the election campaign, and his political opponents basically knew that they had no arguments, no political cards to play against him other than the religion card, because he happened to be a Christian. In fact, he was a double minority, ethnic Chinese and a Christian. And so towards the end of the election campaign, he suddenly found himself facing charges under the blasphemy laws, which of course resulted in him being defeated at the ballot box. But almost as soon as he lost the election, he was put on trial and sentenced to 2 years in prison under the blasphemy laws, simply because of a political ploy to remove him from the political scene. I'm not going to talk about Pakistan, but I do just want to say that the problem with blasphemy laws is that they can result in grave injustices, and taken to the extreme, they can result in death. One of my very good friends in Pakistan was an activist who ended up as the Minister for Minorities in Pakistan, Shahbaz Bhatti. And he was assassinated on the 2nd of March 2011, 10 years ago, for defending people who'd been charged under the blasphemy laws and for calling for reform of the blasphemy laws. And indeed, a few months before Shahbaz's assassination, Salman Taseer, the governor of Punjab, was also assassinated for the same reason. So on this question of where to draw the line on freedom of expression, I believe that freedom of expression should be as wide as possible. I don't believe that it's right to go around gratuitously insulting religions or ideas or other people, but I don't believe legislation should be in place to protect religion from that. There is no such thing as freedom from insult or freedom from hurt feelings. And I believe that religious ideas should be probed, discussed, debated. I personally believe it should be done in a courteous and constructive way. People should police themselves and not gratuitously insult people, but the law should not be there to prevent blasphemy. Of course, the line should be drawn at, as it is currently in this country, at incitement to violence and discrimination and hatred, and that's something we can come back to. Let me turn very briefly to Myanmar, of course, much in the news at the moment because of the coup on the 1st of February, but issues that have existed for some years there. Two particular issues. The first, again, relating to blasphemy. Myanmar has its own form of blasphemy laws, which are used essentially to protect the majority religion, Buddhism. But they are also used for political purposes, misused for political purposes. There was a case of a Buddhist man, a writer and poet called Tin Lin U, a few years ago, who was sentenced to 2 years in prison for insulting religion. And the reason he faced that charge was that he criticized those of his fellow Buddhists who were attacking, inciting and attacking Muslims in the country. And he said that what they were doing was not in keeping with Buddhist principles, and as a result, he was accused of insulting Buddhism. Quite a bizarre charge. But we've also seen laws in Myanmar used to protect the military against criticism. Quite a number of satirists, for example, and dissidents jailed over the recent years for criticizing the military. And of course, if we come on to the right to protest, in the protests since the coup on the 1st of February, we have seen lethal force used by the military. over 800 people have been killed in the last few months, over 6,000 arrested, and over 5,000 still in prison today in Myanmar. So that's where freedom of expression in Myanmar is literally under fire. Finally, I just turn quickly to Hong Kong, and I'm happy in the discussion to turn to issues relating to China as a whole, but I'll focus on Hong Kong for these few remaining remarks. Hong Kong's freedoms have been rapidly dismantled in recent years, and especially over the course of the last year, since the introduction of the very draconian national security law that was imposed almost a year ago in Hong Kong. And this has implications for all basic freedoms. We've seen in the last few days the strangulation of the last remaining pro-democracy newspaper in Hong Kong, the Apple Daily, which it's very likely is going to close in the next few days, not because it doesn't have money or subscribers or customers, but because the authorities have used the national security law to arrest its editor, several of its senior executives, accusing them of publishing articles probably retrospectively, so probably articles before the national security law came into force, advocating the imposition of sanctions on Hong Kong. And under the national security law, the newspaper's assets have been frozen, and that's why it's likely to close, not because it doesn't have money, but because it can't access it. And so this is basically the dying days of any form of free media in Hong Kong. Protests are now effectively banned in Hong Kong under the national security law. In terms of freedom of religion, the Catholic diocese last year, the Cardinal John Tong, actually issued an instruction to clergy to be careful in their sermons and not to say things that could get them into trouble under the national security law. His ominous phrase was quite literally, "Watch your words." The national security law makes it a criminal offence to use its expression collude with foreign political forces, but that's so vaguely defined that what it basically means is that it can be a crime for a Hong Konger now to talk to a foreign journalist, to talk to an activist like me, to talk to foreign politicians. And indeed, one Hong Kong legislator who's now in jail was refused bail because she had been previously in touch with foreign journalists. And the national security law has an extraterritorial clause as well. So in theory, at least, what I say sitting in the safety of my home in London, criticizing the regime in China and in Hong Kong, could be in breach of Hong Kong's national security law, even though I'm nowhere near Hong Kong. There is talk now of the Hong Kong government also introducing legislation to ban insults of government officials and police. And again, I don't advocate gratuitously insulting people, but I worry the definition of that will be so vague that it will basically mean any legitimate criticism will be prohibited. Again, the question where to draw the line. Well, there are principles of defamation and libel and threat and incitement, which are already covered in legislation in principle. And I think that's where we draw the line, and freedom of expression should be as broad as possible. So in conclusion, this is a really important topic. Freedom of expression is under increasing threat around the world. I haven't even really touched on the threats to journalists around the world, but that is a major concern. Physical threats as well as legislative threats. And we should, in my view, be striving for the fullest possible freedom of expression, which allows for healthy debate, for disagreement, for diversity of views, including things like satire and humor, and for exploration and probing in matters of religion and politics. And the limits should only be in place to protect the rights of others, limits to prevent violence, discrimination, or defamation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. That was fascinating. We'll return to some of those topics very shortly. But now I'd like to move on to Loveena Tandon, who is talking about policing freedom of expression, the changing landscape of freedom of speech in the UK. This is from her eyes, the eyes of a foreign journalist reporting experience, particularly so in the last year or two since the pandemic. Loveena, please.
Hello, thank you very much, Kate, and thank you, Benedict. I'm absolutely myself quite privileged to be speaking among such seasoned journalists and activists. So thank you for that and providing me this platform. I am going to bring from where Benedict has been speaking about Myanmar and Pakistan and Hong Kong to the present space where I am, because this is where my experience lies since the time I started reporting. I came to this country in 2006, and soon after that, I have been reporting. And the question that I want to explore, not primarily an answer I'm seeking, but this is more so to set out my experience and explore the question of the freedom of speech and debate we are seeing in the UK, the debate constantly coming up as to where to draw the line in it. It can be and should be draw a line to freedom of speech in the UK. The UK who prides itself to be subscribing to the article that Benedict mentioned and to subscribe to freedom of speech and expression to everybody. Now, freedom of speech for me is a very intriguing subject as such, and I feel every country relates to it and reacts to it in a different way. But what really is, like, I believe that one person's terrorist can be other person's martyr, and one person's freedom of speech can be another person's infringement of civil liberties, which is what I felt I have seen in the last 2 years, rather. But let me begin from an anecdote which sits in my head. Happened in 2011. This was the time when royal wedding, Kate and William were kind of wedded, and also when Osama bin Laden was killed. So the questions that, well, let me just, before I go into the anecdote, can I just say, I'm just saying that the question of freedom of expression is whether everyone should have it, but is the government providing us a space where we can express without fear, hatred, or violence? Now, I will come back to this. And is it given to all equally? So let me go back to 2011. I was going to report and speak to someone who was opposing the royal wedding. As I entered Whitechapel police station, tube station, there were a bunch of people with huge loudspeakers, with giving out leaflets with Osama bin Laden's picture on it, and saying, very kind of subscribing to what he stood for, and deriding British values and the whole Western concept of having created him. I felt that was quite, it could actually border on inciting hatred. And these were people who were born and brought up here, because that is what their accent revealed. And the police, there was heavy police presence around. They were all speaking in English on loudspeakers, and they were allowed to say what they were saying. And while I felt quite shocked, at the same time, I felt, oh, wow, that's great. They are allowed to speak their minds without being curtailed. And great, because there was no violence as such, but what they were saying could be quite hurtful for many people, even around them. Then I also spoke to and interviewed people who were opposing the royal wedding. They, of course, were not given the permission to protest outside Buckingham Palace, but they protest somewhere else. I said, well, that's great. I mean, if someone is against it because they felt that the monarchy stands for imperialism, subscribes to that, that kind of mindset they came from. And I felt, well, okay, they are able to talk and and are free to express their different opinion, even against the pillars of democracy and society that Britain stands for. Then there was a story very soon after where the same group of people heckled the British soldiers, the Pride, and they were walking through and they heckled them, and that was not taken. That was quite distasteful, but they were not very strong. There were some. I think some people were arrested, but there was not much that happened in long term. Now, over a period of time, there were many such things that happened, and then we come to then came a chance for me to cover a protest. And this was in 2016, and I was covering outside in Parliament Square. Prime Minister Modi was here for Commonwealth Games, and there were lots and lots of protests happening in and around. There were many demonstrations, and I was reporting there. And incidentally, I was the only Indian journalist who was present at the time when a group of people took down the Indian flag, tore it away, burnt it, stamped on it. And all I did was to ask who did this and what was the purpose. And I was majorly abused and heckled. The police, there was a very heavy police presence, and no one came, not one person came to protect, except for another colleague, another journalist, ex-BBC journalist, who came and took me out. Similarly, I then became the target of this group's attempt for them for just asking a question. And this happened to me 6 times up till now. I will not count all these times, but the group has consistently tried to intimidate, to the extent that in front of the Indian High Commission, when I was just reporting from far away, they came while I was talking to the camera. They came and put a burnt flag around my neck. They would not touch it because they knew how far to go, and yet nothing was done, except that when I picked up the flag, pieces of flag, a policeman came and respectfully took it from me, saying, "I will put it safe." And that was quite a turning point for me. And then this kept on happening. I reported. So the time this happened to me, I mentioned in the Parliament Square, it was a very heavy news day, and it took me a very long time to just go. And by the end of the day, at 10 o'clock, I went and reported to the police, but nothing came of it. And they said that there's lack of evidence. And this is the line that the police took for a very, very long time, till up till now, actually. 6 times this has happened. And the last time, I'm not going into my own experience. Why I'm reading this too is that there are 2 things that I heard from the Harbour centers. This is harassment. You might feel it harassed, but you are actually not harassed. There's nothing that we can do about it. And the time that stopped reporting on the matter is when a policeman told me that, if you come, why do you come here if you provoke them to heckle you? You should not come and report. So I felt that while the protesters have their own right to protest, I haven't got my right to report has been completely impinged upon, and there has to be something that needs to be done. Now, now in this whole, my personal context, I want to just take it rather further and say that we saw during the lockdown, there were various protests that have been organized. One that started the debate was the one which started from climate change protest, where the protesters went a step ahead, stopped people from going to work, and the question of what is freedom of expression? Do we need to draw a line? Just started. Much can intervene. And in this background, slowly, we saw the protest which was the biggest protest that happened. The Emma Everard happened, but before that, the Black Lives Matter protest. That also slowly started raising the question, the question of whether there needs a line to be drawn. And in this context came the police bill. Now, the question that I have been asking, is that the police bill is so controversial, and I don't say that I'm an expert on it. But can the police protect journalists like us while the protesters should be allowed to protest? And can the people who are involved in reporting on the protest, their right be protected as well? Or will it be a case where there is, in Emma Everard's case, there were some girls who were handcuffed and taken, while in many of the protests that I have been personally, and also noticed in few in Black Lives Matter, where the police couldn't do much. So is this the case of freedom of expression, protest, but is this a case where if you are not intimidated, then a certain crowd will intimidate you and you don't take any action? Well, you will shut down the person who you can have control on. So what I'm leading to is that I have the question of freedom of expression. UK prides to be a place that subscribes to freedom of expression, but sometimes I've said they hide behind the fact that on privacy laws, they hide behind the fact that who can be controlled, and the whole that is not very equally implemented. I have felt so. It is very important to subscribe to the freedom of expression. At the same time, it's very important that other person's freedom, both sides, the freedom of expression of both sides should be safeguarded. So is the government, through policing bill and through others, providing an environment where people's opinions can be expressed without feeling intimidated, fear of bully or violence? I am not quite sure that this is happening here, and whether policing bill that has been brought will be able to actually intimidate the people who they are supposed to protect more, or are able to widen the horizon and let people like me report freely. I'm not quite sure. This is raised that during the COVID times, while protests were on issues that I would subscribe to as well, but would not be upon the civil liberty or the rights of the people who had very old parents and who were very scared and were in houses cooped up and completely curtailing their own freedom to go out because they wanted to protect their loved ones. So, freedom of expression, and it is for the government to be able to provide a safe space where everyone is able to express their opinion without feeling intimidated or bullied like I have been. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Loveena, for sharing that with us. Well, to speak more on that, we are very honoured to have with us a very senior civil servant, Janis Makarewich-Hall, who's joining us today to talk about the UK's National Action Plan for the Safety of Journalists. Can I hand over to you, Janis?
Thank you, Kate, and thanks, Loveena and Benedict. I wanted to just talk a little bit about the work that we are doing around the safety of journalists, and in particular, the National Committee for the Safety of Journalists and the National Action Plan for the Safety of Journalists. So the National Committee for the Safety of Journalists was established following a recommendation by the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe to its member states. And whilst the UK doesn't face some of the same challenges as other countries, we had seen a number of sort of very worrying incidents of individual journalists being threatened or abused physically and online. And so wanted to be more proactive in creating a safer environment for which journalists can work. You know, we recognise the vital role journalists and journalism plays in our democracy, and indeed holding those in power to account. So in 2019, the first Global Media Freedom Conference was held in London. And that was where we announced the establishment of the National Committee. We wanted to demonstrate the importance of the issue and the fact that we were committed to addressing challenges at home as well as overseas. So how did we establish the National Committee? So it was really a joint work through my department, DCMS, also working with the Home Office and the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. We were looking to sort of engage with stakeholders to sort of gauge the interest in joining up and setting up a committee. We felt it was really important to have representatives of employers as well as journalists themselves, so who could offer sort of different perspectives. So we reached out to the National Union of Journalists as well as organizations representing editors and publishers, and of course the BBC, who are a large employer of journalists in the UK. So my department, DCMS, doesn't have the policy responsibility for criminal justice. So we were really keen to have a minister from the Home Office jointly chair the committee. So this would help make sure that we had a really joined up approach and ensure we were able to really engage with the sort of law enforcement bodies. Policing and prosecution is devolved in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and we wanted this to be a real national effort. So we engaged with colleagues in the relevant administrations to help us form connections with the relevant criminal justice and prosecuting authorities, inviting representation onto our committee. The OSCE recommendation referred to policing, prosecution, and journalist representatives. However, we wanted to make sure we had organizations who could look at the bigger picture of journalist safety, and so invited NGOs, Reporters Without Borders, and Index on Censorship for their expertise and experiences. The committee has a domestic focus, but we've invited observers with international experience, such as the Foreign Press Association, to attend our national committee members to sort of give an insight into the safety challenges facing journalists operating overseas. We held our inaugural meeting in July last year and the second one in January this year. We've had really excellent engagement and enthusiasm for this work from all of the committee members. So at its first meeting in July last year, the National Committee committed to developing a domestic action plan, so ready for the subsequent meeting in 6 months' time. We looked at sort of international examples of plans. You know, each country will take its own approach which fits into that particular national context. The fact that we were developing the first UK plan sort of gave us quite a lot of freedom to be as ambitious as we could and develop actions that we thought would have a real impact on the lives of journalists. This did involve a significant amount of work really trying to examine the evidence, which also included needing to capture this via police, prosecuting authorities, employers, and journalists themselves. We really engaged widely and explored what could be done to make a real and practical difference, sort of both now and in the future. And in particular, we engaged directly with working journalists, so at local and national level, freelance and employed, through bilateral discussions and a number of roundtables to sort of better understand their experiences and where they thought action was needed most. A common theme across all our engagement with journalists was the rise of online abuse, particularly targeted at journalists who are women and of protected characteristics. It was also important that employers, unions, the criminal justice system, and the government had a role in developing these interventions. So it was clear that this required a really joined up and concerted effort. So we also reached out to the political parties in the UK, so that's the Labour Party, the SNP, and the Liberal Democrats, to seek their support for the National Action Plan, which we secured. And we were also able to include a statement of support from the Prime Minister in the plan, which reflects the sort of government's strong commitment to journalist safety. So I just thought I'd just talk a little bit about what's actually in the plan. So our overall aim is to ensure that journalists operating in the UK are as safe as possible, reduce the number of attacks and threats issued to journalists, and ensuring those that are responsible for such are brought to justice. And in order to support this goal, we have sort of 5 key areas. The first one is around increasing our understanding of the problem. And I wanted to point out something that we've just launched, actually. It's a call for evidence. It was launched on the 2nd of June and closes on the 14th of July. The focus is on journalists and those who work with journalists, but also those who have expertise like academics or NGOs. And this is really to help us develop an evidence base to understand the nature and volume of threats and abuse against journalists who are operating in the UK. The responses will be used to sort of better understand the nature and scale of the problem, which the government, alongside the National Committee, is seeking to solve. So we really want to understand sort of how deep it goes and how wide it goes. This will also be complemented with an annual survey of journalists, which we will do later on in the year, and also our continued work to look at sort of insights and best practice, what's happening overseas. And then the second thing is around enhancing the criminal justice system's response to tackling crimes against journalists. So this very much is looking at things like training for student journalists on police operations, designated journalist safety liaison officers in police forces, training for police to be updated to reflect the role of journalists, some of those sorts of things. We also, our third pillar is around improving the public recognition of the value of journalists. And two of the key things here are the publication of a media literacy strategy later on this year, which will really look to demonstrate the value of journalism and journalists. And then using the Journalism Matters Week, which normally happens in November, to really highlight the safety of journalists. And then the other thing, the next sort of bullet is around support journalists and their employers to build the resources they need to protect sort of personnel safety. And this is very much looking at where best practice is and bringing it all together. There will be things like a publication on guidance on the laws for online harassment, support packs, journalists receiving training on police operations, looking around bringing together a single online portal where sort of all journalists could access this sort of information, working with publishers and broadcasters on their safety policies, and looking around whether or not you would have a designated safety officer in each publication or broadcaster. And then the fifth one is really around helping online platforms to tackle the wider issues of abuse. And this is through the introduction of the Online Safety Bill, but also our work with Facebook and Twitter to sort of respond very promptly to complaints of threats to journalists and their safety. And it's all well and good to sort of set out a plan, which we did in March. But now we need to think about how we're going to measure and monitor. So are we doing what we said we were going to do, and is it making a difference? So we've got a framework in place, and we're starting to see how that's working. I mean, it's quite early, so we're not certain yet. But as new information comes to light, either about the problem or the impact of an intervention as they are put in place, the National Action Plan is dynamic. It's meant to be revisited and updated. And we have, through the National Committee, already committed to reporting annually on the progress or otherwise of the commitments. And the committee will hold to account each of the stakeholders who has committed to an intervention. So both at the formal meetings, which we are held twice a year, but also in the day-to-day interactions with the sector. I'm pleased to say that we've had quite a lot of support for this work, but we continue to be interested in, how it is working on the ground. And I would really encourage people to think about responding back to the call for evidence, because we are genuinely keen to understand, is this working and how is it working, and is it hitting the problem that we're hoping that it will. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Janis, for all of that. We will repeat those details and make them available for the call to evidence, both in the end credits of today's program, if anyone wishes to submit some evidence to that. Thank you all to all three of our speakers. Before I throw it open to questions from the floor, I'd like to start with a question. This one, I think, is for Janis. Britain does talk a really good game about the importance of a free press. The UK is a founding member of the International Media Freedom Coalition, and we're devising this action plan to protect journalists. What role can UK diplomacy play in promoting press freedom around the world? And I'm thinking particularly of China and the flashpoints around Southeast Asia.
Thank you for that. So I have a remit for sort of domestic media freedom and journalist safety, but I work very closely with the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and through the sort of their Media Freedom Coalition, do quite a lot of that sort of work. I don't have all the details, but I'm very happy to put people in contact with that or find out a bit more if they would find that useful.
Great, thank you.
I should also say it was also, as part of the G7, it formed part of the communique. So that was sort of demonstrated by the Foreign Secretary how important he places media freedom.
Thank you. Benedict, did you have anything to add to that, being with your focus particularly being on Asia, China and Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is I really welcome the fact that I think it was Jeremy Hunt when he was Foreign Secretary, and I know the current Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, has continued it. Jeremy Hunt introduced these two big sort of focused campaigns for the Foreign Office on media freedom and on freedom of religion. So the two issues that I highlighted in my remarks were made priority focuses for the UK foreign policy. And I know that's continued. I think in terms of practical things the UK can do, definitely it should be speaking out in every fora. It should be working, for example, with the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression, and finding ways with allies to really champion and protect journalists and media freedom as a key part of its foreign policy.
Thank you. Okay, now we've got a couple of video questions that have been submitted. The first one is from Wesley in London, who has this question for our panel.
When it comes to matters of freedom of speech, why is the government actually legislating as to what people can say and what they can't say? I mean, surely, even though people may say things that are extremely offensive, as long as they're not inciting somebody to violence or a hate crime or to break the law, surely they should have the right to say these things and then also be challenged by people that think the opposite.
Good question. Who would like to give their thoughts on that?
I'm happy to make a I'm happy to make a brief comment. I mean, I think it's a very good question, and I think I sort of answered it in my remarks earlier. Essentially, I think that the only limitations that should be in place, and Loveena really articulated this very well, the limitations that should be in place on freedom of expression are limitations aimed at protecting the rights of others. Government should put in place, in fact, we already have legislation to prohibit incitement to violence, to hatred, to discrimination, all of which significantly affect the rights of others. But apart from those limitations, and of course there is a fine line in some forms of online, trolling and abuse, it can stray into threats and incitement and intimidation, and that's where government does have a role. And I know that there's a consultation going on, and these things will be debated in that process. But I think short of those limitations, there should be as much freedom of expression as possible. And I agree with the person who asked the question that there isn't a right to be free from being offended or being upset. That doesn't exist, and we're all subjected to whether it's opinions or just things we see in daily life that we all might find, for one reason or another, objectionable or even insulting. And I don't think government should be trying to protect people from things that people may find insulting, but government should protect people from threat, violence, and discrimination.
Thank you. Loveena, I wanted to add to that. Oh, yes.
No, go on, and I'll take it together. Go on, what you were saying.
No, I want your thoughts on that. I mean, you spoke of an incident of being harassed, very severely harassed in public, but that your harassers knew the law and they knew not to touch you. You know, they knew that physical violence will be very strongly acted on, but there are many other types of ways of attacking us, verbally and increasingly online, where it's not even in the same physical realm.
So I will take what you're saying on board and also add to what the question has been asked. Well, number one, I think if I could talk about myself, my attackers did push me, but there was no evidence of that because the CCTV didn't catch that, and my equipment fell down, but still that was not taken into consideration. That's one. Plus subjected to very bad racial cyberbullying online, and that was not acted upon either. So I'm quite hopeful that from what Janis and the department are doing, we will be able to knock on some door to protect us. That's one. And what I want to lead an answer to from the question that has been is that there is more regulation, which is what the point of what I was saying was, that I have seen that from a point anyone could say anything to a point where a policing bill has to be brought. The question of freedom of speech has shrunk, the space has shrunk, but does that space in any way provide protection to everybody and both sections of the society that have different and difficult opinions? I'm not quite sure that, because me being a case in point. So while we recently saw a BBC journalist who had to run into Tandon in street because he was being heckled and there were some charges, but that didn't happen in my case, and I find that quite so what I'm trying to say is that the regulation, if it is brought about, needs to make sure that freedom of speech can exist for both the parties, the protesters as well as those who don't protest and those who are reporting on it. Yes, when someone is an offense, like Benedict said, that is up to them. I mean, there has to be satire, there has to be a bit of teasing in as well, which is also sometimes people say we don't know what to say these days because we could be pinned to the wall for anything. So that's not the kind of society that we want to be living in, and we don't want to be regulated to that extent. But if there is a situation where you are being intimidated or you are being bullied, or it goes to the extent of violence, then, or a loss of public property, which is what justice happened. I think that happened in front of Indian High Commission that I have covered. There has been damage to the building, and so if there is a loss of in society, that is where actually, if there is this regulation, there it should act. We should be provided through regulation, through government, space where all of us and all our different diverse opinion can exist without feeling intimidated, bullied, or violent. Fear of that. And I'm not quite sure that the regulation is coming in. The policing bill is coming in, but I'm not sure whether it will curtail the speech or it will actually widen the horizon for us. I'm not very sure and confident.
Well, that's interesting. Well, I do think when you talk about this issue, you can't talk about it without recognising the people who are being targeted. Certainly when we at the Foreign Press Association did a brief survey of our members earlier this year in response to Janis's department's new action plan, we found it was over 40% of our members reported having experienced some form of verbal or physical abuse. And those numbers skewed very strongly towards members of the Foreign Press Association who obviously were of different ethnicities, who were female, and who were even perhaps not of a different ethnicity but clearly spoke in a different language. They're heavily targeted towards picking out people who are ethnic minorities, women, different in some way. And I think bills like this policing bill seek to recognise that it's not a level playing field of people who are targeted.
If I may come in, it is what happened to the BBC journalists last week was a really shocking example of what happens to people online and in person all the time. And this is the sort of this is exactly the sort of thing that we're hoping sort of our national committee, our national action plan will help. You know, journalists should be able to do their job without fear of their own physical and online safety. And I'm not surprised at all, Kate, by the response that we had from the Foreign Press Association. We see the same all the time, and you know, we're close to 300 respondents so far to our call for evidence. And sadly, but perhaps not unpredictably, you know, the tales of abuse are pretty horrific by most people.
Yes. Just to add to that, this was Nicholas Watt, who was Newsnight's political editor, and he was attacked. He was heckled as he left Downing Street on Monday. He was basically chased by a mob, which is not much fun for anyone. And it's being looked into, but the Metropolitan Police officers who were there didn't seem to be close enough to do anything about it. And increasingly, given the nature of modern media, that no one has a big crew of 4 or 5 people when you're out, especially when you're out filming. It's the cameras are smaller, the microphones are hidden, people are often even filming on their iPhone, and it's blurred the lines between what's a journalist and what's just someone filming who hecklers may feel is a fair target. And we used to have a situation where journalists were quite visible as such. They had tons of huge equipment and quite a large team usually. And that's increasingly gone. Budget cuts mean no one has the money for sound recordists and field producers and so on. And it's made people definitely more vulnerable. And that's just TV. Print journalists have always worked alone and are very much those sorts of targets. Well, I should move on to our next question, another Facebook question. This one is from Rachel, who sent in a video question. We'll play that now. Sorry, that's not a video question. It's in print. Rachel says, if legislation to regulate free speech is intended to prevent hate, doesn't it just mean that people will hate but just remain silent and so all debate is shut down? Who would like to give me their thoughts on that? Loveena?
Can I? Yes. I would like to just quickly read the question once more. If legislation regulates free speech is intended to prevent hate, and does it not mean hate but just remains until all debate is shut? And that is what we fear, and exactly what I was saying, that I don't know if regulation has come forth is really going to protect people on both the sides. And that is where my dilemma, my question is, that is because the new rule says that the police will have more powers to move the crowd, to control the noise levels, to control the number, to control where they are doing, and to make more arrests. And I'm not sure that people will be able to protect. Will feel protected and will feel that there is an environment to express their opinion, and so will try and remain silent. And those people who are not in big groups will remain silent, like me, who just themselves from reporting in with that kind of crowd. So I actually quite subscribe to this, and I myself asking that question as to will it do it or not.
We have a question from Mandar Dani writing in our chat asking how each country reacts to freedom of speech, which is it's different in each country. So how can one of them constitute what's the right code of conduct? Benedict, is that something I could get a comment, your thoughts on?
How does it constitute the right code of conduct? I mean, I think my brief response to that is to go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other important treaties, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and so on, and basically to take articles that I outlined at the beginning, Article 18, 19, and 20, the rights to thought, conscience, religion, expression, and peaceful assembly, as the basis universally. That's why it's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and for countries then to apply that in their contexts. But of course, countries that don't have democratic systems of government, countries that have authoritarian systems, are not going to respect the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at all anyway. I mean, places like Myanmar and China fundamentally violate basic human rights on a widespread and systematic basis every day. So that raises a whole different question with them. But I think the basic principle should be to apply the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and to develop approaches based on that safeguard the human rights of everybody, both those expressing a view and those whose right to be free from intimidation, from discrimination, from violence, to be protected as well.
Particularly now, I guess, in the era of pandemic, when previously very liberal societies have had to become also quite authoritarian with lockdowns in countries like our own, which was something that the people, the freedom-loving people of Britain were supposed to. It was thought we wouldn't put up with a lockdown for more than 2 or 3 weeks if we throw our minds back sort of 18 months ago. And yet we've all learned to live with extreme positions on our freedom in the last 2 years.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think clearly a pandemic is an exceptional time, and in the principles of universal human rights, they can be limited in the interests of public health, public safety, public order, and this was obviously an exceptional time. I was surprisingly, as someone who spends my life championing the human rights of others, I was quite a willing acceptor of the lockdown. I didn't particularly share the anti-lockdown protesters' views, because I could see the way the pandemic was going, and I thought it was in everyone's interest to take these measures, provided, as was the case, that the measures were legislated by a democratically elected parliament, were temporary, were kept under review, and are ended when it's advisable to end, which hopefully we're now coming towards that moment. So I think it was an exceptional situation. And of course, freedom of expression was not restricted at all. And that's the difference between our lockdown, where, yes, our movement was restricted, but we could express ourselves online and in various ways. Those living in authoritarian states, where it's their freedom of conscience and freedom of expression that is directly under attack.
That's an excellent point. Thank you. I think we've just got time for one last question. We have a question from Gary, which we're about to see. Gary has a question. He is asking, to what extent the UK ensures the safety of people in Hong Kong? Is there anything in the 1950 treaty that gives them any power? Well, back to you, Benedict. I think this is your area of expertise. We've certainly seen a huge influx of people from Hong Kong in the last year, since the UK's widening of passport allowances to BNO, former BNO passport holders.
Yeah, I mean, that is certainly one thing that the government has done that I applaud, and it does give those who are eligible for the British national overseas status that escape route. It doesn't actually do anything to protect those who remain in Hong Kong, so it doesn't solve the problem, but it is a welcome lifeline for those who need to get out. Although I would also just add to that that there are many people in particular danger who are born after 1997 and are therefore not eligible for the BNO route. And I'm encouraging the government to try to look at what, and other governments as well, to look at what options they can offer to them. But in terms of people who remain in Hong Kong, I think the government should be a lot more robust. The government has become more robust in its rhetoric, more statements, more strongly worded statements, and that's welcome. But I think the reality is that the Chinese regime doesn't respond to statements, and therefore we need much more targeted action, which may not protect people in the short term, but it will at least deliver a clear message to Beijing that it can't be allowed to trample on the freedom of the people of Hong Kong with impunity. And so therefore, I believe we need targeted sanctions against, not against Hong Kong as a whole, but against officials in the Hong Kong and Chinese governments who are responsible for dismantling the freedoms of Hong Kong in flagrant breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. So there's definitely more that the UK can do to make the consequences of what they've done for the Chinese regime much more punitive and painful for them, as well as offering lifelines for people who need to get out.
Absolutely.
Actually, I have one question for Benedict, if I may. I just, while you were talking, just thinking that, yes, and there was someone, I think, who asked that every country has a different response to freedom of expression. But do you think what you just mentioned about the steps that UK has taken, and others as well, that UK probably would take, what has the response been like to that? Is there something that is more positive, or the freedom of expression continues to be curtailed at the same pace?
I think in terms of the situation on the ground in Hong Kong, it gets worse and worse every day, and so international pressure has not had the effect that we would wish of slowing down or reversing that. It's continued, and the most latest developments, the strangulation of the Apple Daily newspaper, the arrest of several of their staff last week, is just the latest example of that. But I think the reason for that is not that the regime doesn't respond to pressure. It's that the right kind of pressure has not been put yet, and that's why I'm urging the British government to impose that. They haven't imposed any sanctions, and yet they've said that the Chinese regime is in repeated breach of the international treaty, the Sino-British Joint Declaration, but they haven't put any consequences in place for that breach. So I think if the right kind of targeted sanctions were in place, and if those sanctions were coordinated with other like-minded countries, then that could have some positive effect.
Well,
but are they shying away from? Sorry, are they shying away because China has a huge economic? They can twist arms with their economic investments, and therefore countries, including UK, is not able to do or say or garner much.
Yes, well, I think that China's economic influence in the UK is not nearly as big as some people think it is, but there are definitely people in government that put too much emphasis on the trading relationship with China at the cost of our values, and that's the sort of battle that I and others are fighting, is to try to get. And to be fair, I mean, opinion has shifted, I think, particularly in Parliament, but there's a lot more work to do to get the government. The government strengthened its rhetoric, but it's still rather wedded to trying to have the best of both, trying to have a trading relationship with China and call it out for human rights. And I think it will. It's coming to a point where it will have to make a choice.
Perhaps we can end on a slightly optimistic note, where I think we've all seen that America, since the last election, is now, its values are perhaps aligning slightly more with those of the other G7 nations, for instance, and that we could see a more unified approach to threats like that posed by China. Am I being overly optimistic?
No, I think you're right to be optimistic. I think the language around the G7 was definitely in the right direction. I mean, it's a good start. It's not everything that is needed. There's more to be done. But I think definitely the leadership of President Biden in taking a multilateral approach, talk of an alliance of democracies, a summit of democracies, the position that Australia has courageously taken in recent years, standing up to China. I think other democratic countries should stand alongside Australia and stand together in the way that President Biden and others are saying. So it's a good start, and it's definitely moving in a better direction than it was, but there's a lot more to do.
Janis, would you also be optimistic?
Well, I would be optimistic in the sense of the work that we're doing to sort of support journalists and their safety has been really well received, like genuinely well received. And sort of the police, the prosecutors, the employers, journalists themselves have all been willing to work with us in a really constructive manner, which I'm not sure necessarily would have happened before. So I feel I am, you know, it's still a poor situation for people that are in at the moment, but I'm hoping that some of the things we might be able to do will make it a bit more bearable.
Yeah. All right, well, we need to draw it to a close then. A couple of very late questions have just come in. I'm sorry we don't have time for them today, but we have enjoyed this hour and a bit very, very much. I would like to very much thank everyone who's taken the time to comment and to watch. It's very much appreciated. And I'd like to very much thank our panel of Benedict Rogers, Loveena Tandon, and Janis Makarewich-Hall. You've been watching Open Forum, and we hope to see you again at our next webinar, which will be in a month. Topic to be confirmed, but it's sure to be a good one. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.